Daniel, a successful businessman, prided himself on his sharp suits and even sharper judgments of others. Little did he know, a small act of kindness he dismissed would change the course of his life forever. Daniel was the epitome of modern success, young, wealthy, and sharply dressed. Yet beneath the polished surface lay a man driven by arrogance, judging others solely by their appearance and status. To him, those who didn't fit his standards were invisible, unworthy. But fate had plans to teach him a lesson he would never forget. It was a brisk morning, and Daniel, rushing to a meeting, cursed under his breath when his car jolted to a halt. A flat tire. Irritated, he stepped out, scanning the unfamiliar neighborhood. His tailored suit and polished shoes stood in sharp contrast to the dusty mechanic shop nearby. A man approached, a middle-aged worker with grease-stained overalls and rough hands. "Need some help?" the man asked kindly, introducing himself as Hector. But Daniel's eyes swept over him with disdain. "No, thank you," he replied curtly. "I'll call someone who knows what they're doing." Hector stepped back, slightly startled but unfazed. "Suit yourself," he said softly, watching as Daniel waved him off with a dismissive hand. The mechanic returned to his shop, the faint echo of Daniel's sharp words lingering in the air. Daniel's irritation boiled over as he struggled with his phone to contact a service. Time ticked away, his anxiety mounting. He could still see Hector working in the corner of his eye, but pride kept him from reconsidering the offer of help. As Daniel finally sped off after resolving the tire issue himself, he left behind more than just Hector, he left an opportunity for humility. Hector watched him drive away, shaking his head. Little did either of them know how soon their paths would cross again. Driving away from the scene, Daniel gripped the steering wheel tightly, his frustration bubbling over. He couldn't shake the encounter with Hector from his mind, the dirt under his fingernails, the grease on his clothes. How could someone like that even think they could help me? Daniel muttered under his breath. His pride echoed in every decision he made. Calling for professional roadside assistance would have taken longer, but Daniel chose to do it himself rather than rely on someone he deemed incompetent. The arrogance that had fueled his success was now steering him toward his own downfall. As he merged onto the highway, a sense of smug satisfaction settled over him. He had handled the problem, proving yet again that he didn't need help from people beneath him. What Daniel failed to notice, however, was the faint but growing tremor in his brakes. The memory of Hector's calm demeanor lingered in the back of his mind, but Daniel brushed it aside. "What does he know about my world?" he thought, reassuring himself that his choices were always right. He was a man of control, a man of precision, at least in his own eyes. But pride often blinds us to the cracks forming beneath the surface. As Daniel sped forward, life had already begun laying the groundwork for a lesson he would never forget. The decision he made that day wasn't just about a flat tire, it was a choice to reject kindness, empathy, and wisdom. The highway stretched out before Daniel, his confidence building with every mile. He tapped impatiently on the steering wheel, already calculating how to salvage his delayed meeting. His car, sleek and expensive, symbolized his success, a fortress of his superiority. But beneath the hood, trouble was brewing. A faint screech echoed as he pressed the brake lightly. He frowned, dismissing it as nothing more than a minor annoyance. Minutes later, the screech turned into a grinding noise, louder and more alarming. Panic set in as he realized the brakes weren't responding. The fortress he relied on was failing him. Come on," he shouted, gripping the wheel as his car veered dangerously close to the guardrail. Other drivers honked, swerving to avoid him. Daniel's heart raced as he yanked the emergency brake, desperate to stop the car. The metallic screech was deafening, and then, everything went dark. When he came to, the world was blurry, his head pounding. Strapped to a stretcher, Daniel was rushed into a modest hospital. He felt the weight of humiliation creeping in as strangers gathered, murmuring about the accident. For a man so focused on appearances, the vulnerability of being carried in front of others felt like a blow to his very identity. Daniel's arrogance had led him to ignore the warning signs, both in his car and his life. The crash wasn't just a physical collision, it was a harsh awakening. But the full weight of that lesson was still waiting for him inside those hospital walls. Daniel's eyes fluttered open, the sterile smell of antiseptic filling his senses. He winced, trying to sit up, but the dull ache in his body forced him back down. A nurse entered, her kind face framed by the dim light of the modest hospital room. This wasn't the high-end facility Daniel would have chosen, it was a community hospital, small and unassuming. He looked around, noting the outdated equipment and plain walls. Everything about the place screamed simplicity, a stark contrast to the world of luxury he was used to. Daniel's discomfort grew. He shifted in the bed, tugging at the blanket as though it carried the weight of his shame. "Mr. Daniels, you're lucky to be alive," the nurse said gently, handing him water. The brakes failed completely. If it weren't for the quick thinking of others on the road, it could have been much worse. Her words hung in the air, and Daniel nodded stiffly, swallowing his pride along with the water. As she left, a faint voice outside the door caught his attention. Familiar, calm, and grounded. He strained to listen, his heart sinking when he realized who it was, Hector. "We're all set with the oxygen tank repairs," Hector was saying to someone. "Let me know if anything else needs fixing." Daniel's mind reeled. What was Hector doing here? The same man he had dismissed earlier was now somewhere close, speaking with confidence and authority. He pressed his head back into the pillow, waves of embarrassment and curiosity washing over him. For the first time in years, Daniel felt small. This hospital wasn't just a place for healing wounds, it was where Daniel's arrogance would be stripped away, layer by layer. And Hector, the man he had judged so harshly, would unknowingly be the catalyst. The door to Daniel's room creaked open, and in stepped Hector, holding a clipboard and a toolbox. The sight hit Daniel like a wave, this was the same man he had insulted that morning. His grease-stained overalls were replaced by a simple shirt and jeans, but his calm demeanor remained unchanged. Hector approached the bed, glancing briefly at Daniel. "Good to see you awake," he said with a nod. There was no trace of resentment in his voice, only professionalism. Daniel's mouth opened, but no words came out. The realization of their reversed roles left him momentarily paralyzed. "I volunteer here," Hector continued, setting down his toolbox. "The equipment in this hospital is old, but I do what I can to keep it running. Today, it's the oxygen tanks." His tone was matter-of-fact, but the weight of his words hung heavy in the air. This man, whom Daniel had dismissed as incompetent, was ensuring the hospital's ability to save lives. For the first time, Daniel looked beyond Hector's appearance. The lines on his face spoke of hard work and resilience. His hands, calloused and worn, were instruments of service and care. Hector wasn't just fixing machines, he was holding together the lifeline of an entire community. "I didn't know," Daniel muttered, his voice barely audible. Hector glanced at him with a faint smile. "Most people don't," he replied simply, returning to his work. There was no malice in his words, no need for vindication. Hector's humility left Daniel in stunned silence. As Hector finished and prepared to leave, Daniel felt a pang of guilt, a knot forming in his chest. "Hector, wait," he blurted, but the mechanic was already out the door, leaving Daniel alone with his thoughts. The walls of his ego were beginning to crumble, brick by brick. Confined to his hospital bed, Daniel found himself observing the life within the hospital, a world far removed from his own. His curiosity about Hector grew with every passing hour. When the nurses spoke of him, their voices were filled with admiration. "He's a blessing," one said. "Always here when we need him." The next day, Daniel saw Hector again, this time in the corner of the hospital's maintenance room. The space was cramped, filled with outdated machinery and tools, yet Hector moved with purpose, repairing an old defibrillator. His focus and dedication were unshakable, even in the simplest of tasks. Daniel noticed how others interacted with Hector. Doctors, nurses, even patients greeted him warmly. They spoke to him not with pity or condescension, but with genuine respect. "Thank you, Hector," one nurse said, her voice filled with gratitude. "We couldn't do this without you." Hector nodded humbly, wiping his hands on a rag before moving on to the next task. What struck Daniel the most wasn't just Hector's skill but his attitude. Despite the physical labor and modest surroundings, Hector seemed content, fulfilled, even. His life wasn't defined by wealth or status but by the impact he made on others. The contrast to Daniel's own life was staggering. Watching Hector, Daniel felt a heaviness in his chest. He had spent years chasing success, believing it was the only measure of worth. Yet here was Hector, a man he once dismissed, living a life of purpose and meaning. It was both humbling and unsettling. For the first time, Daniel began to reflect, not just on Hector's life, but on his own. The questions he had avoided for years now loomed large: what did success truly mean? And at what cost had he achieved it? Lying in his hospital bed that night, Daniel couldn't sleep. Hector's quiet strength and unwavering humility played on a loop in his mind. He thought of his own life, his expensive suits, his luxury car, his high-powered meetings. For years, he had believed these things defined him, yet they now felt hollow. The memory of his interaction with Hector earlier that week replayed vividly. He remembered his sharp words, the dismissive wave of his hand. The more he reflected, the deeper his shame grew. How had he been so blind? How many others had he judged unfairly, dismissing their value without a second thought? Daniel's thoughts spiraled further. He began to see the cracks in the image of himself he had carefully constructed. His success wasn't built on kindness or connection but on pride and exclusion. For the first time, he allowed himself to confront the emptiness that came with such a life. The following morning, Daniel asked a nurse about Hector. "Why does he do it?" he asked, genuinely curious. The nurse smiled warmly. "Hector believes in helping others. He's been volunteering here for years, repairing equipment we could never afford to replace. He says it's his way of giving back." Daniel was struck by the simplicity of Hector's philosophy. No fanfare, no expectations of recognition, just quiet acts of kindness that made a difference. The words lingered, giving back. They stirred something within Daniel, a small spark of awareness that perhaps his life had been missing something vital. As the days passed, Daniel continued to observe Hector and reflect on his own actions. His arrogance had once shielded him from self-doubt, but now, stripped of that armor, he felt vulnerable. Yet in that vulnerability, he saw the possibility of change, a chance to rebuild not just his perspective, but his life. Daniel's recovery forced him to slow down, a foreign concept for a man accustomed to controlling every moment of his life. Each day in the modest hospital stripped away another layer of his pride. He was no longer the untouchable businessman but a man grappling with his flaws and weaknesses. During his physical therapy sessions, Daniel encountered patients from all walks of life. Their stories of resilience moved him. One elderly woman shared how Hector had repaired her wheelchair when the hospital couldn't afford a replacement. "Without him," she said with a trembling voice, "I'd be stuck at home, unable to move." Hearing these stories, Daniel began to feel a deep sense of inadequacy. He realized how shallow his life had been, built on superficial judgments and fleeting accomplishments. Hector's simple acts of kindness, unnoticed by the world, carried more weight than all of Daniel's corporate achievements. One afternoon, Daniel decided to step out of his comfort zone. He asked a nurse if he could help with small tasks, despite his injuries. She handed him a clipboard, assigning him to take notes for patient needs. It was menial work, but for Daniel, it was a revelation. For the first time, he wasn't the one giving orders, he was serving others. His most humbling moment came when Hector approached him during one of these tasks. "You're doing good work," Hector said with a nod, his tone sincere. Daniel could barely meet his gaze. "I didn't think I could," Daniel admitted, his voice low. "I've been so wrong about so much." Hector's reply was simple but profound. "It's never too late to start doing the right thing." Those words stuck with Daniel, echoing in his mind long after Hector walked away. They became a mantra, a reminder that humility wasn't a weakness, it was the beginning of true strength. The weight of his past arrogance bore down heavily on Daniel as he watched Hector work tirelessly one afternoon. The man he had dismissed as incompetent was the very embodiment of compassion and skill. It was clear now, Daniel owed him more than an apology. He owed him acknowledgement, respect, and gratitude. Summoning his courage, Daniel approached Hector in the hospital workshop. The smell of grease and metal filled the air as Hector adjusted a piece of equipment. He looked up, his expression calm but curious, as Daniel stood awkwardly in the doorway. "Do you have a moment?" Daniel asked hesitantly. Hector nodded, wiping his hands on a rag. Daniel hesitated, struggling to find the right words. I need to say I'm sorry," he began, his voice trembling. "For how I treated you that morning. I was rude, arrogant, and completely wrong. You didn't deserve that." Hector listened silently, his gaze steady but kind. "I judged you without knowing anything about you," Daniel continued. "And now, seeing what you do here, how much you give to others, I feel ashamed." For a moment, the room was quiet, filled only with the hum of machinery. Then Hector spoke, his tone gentle. "We all have our bad days," he said with a small smile. "What matters is that you're here now, owning up to it. That takes courage." Daniel felt a knot in his chest loosen. Hector's forgiveness wasn't just kind, it was freeing. "Thank you," Daniel said earnestly. "I don't deserve your generosity, but I'm grateful for it." Hector extended his hand, and Daniel shook it firmly. In that moment, he felt a shift, a breaking down of walls he had spent years building. It wasn't just forgiveness Hector had given him. It was a chance to start anew, armed with humility and a newfound sense of purpose. Daniel left the workshop that day feeling lighter, yet a sense of responsibility lingered in his heart. Hector's forgiveness had been a gift, but it was also a challenge. It wasn't enough to apologize, Daniel knew he had to act, to live in a way that honored the lesson he had learned. His first steps were small but sincere. Still recovering, Daniel began observing the hospital staff more closely, offering to help wherever he could. Whether it was carrying files or simply listening to a nurse recount a stressful day, Daniel sought to make himself useful. The humility of these tasks was transformative. For the first time, his actions were driven by kindness rather than self-interest. Outside the hospital, Daniel reached out to his employees and colleagues. He made an effort to listen to their concerns and ideas, something he had rarely done before. Slowly, he began to see them not as tools for his success but as individuals with their own dreams and struggles. This shift in perspective opened doors to genuine relationships and trust. The biggest change came when Daniel visited the mechanic shop where Hector worked. He approached the staff, curious about their lives and challenges. Learning that many of them struggled to afford proper tools or supplies, Daniel decided to make an investment, not out of pity, but out of a desire to contribute meaningfully. He funded new equipment for the shop, ensuring they could continue their work with greater ease. Each act of kindness, though small, ignited a sense of fulfillment Daniel had never experienced before. The wealth and power he once chased now felt insignificant compared to the simple joy of helping others. Bit by bit, Daniel began to shed the arrogance that had defined him for so long. By the time he left the hospital, Daniel was no longer the same man who had walked in. His transformation wasn't complete, but it was genuine, a journey fueled by humility, reflection, and the quiet strength of people like Hector. As Daniel continued his journey of transformation, the impact of his change began to spread like ripples in a pond. His actions, though quiet and understated, inspired those around him to reevaluate their own lives. The man once known for his sharp words and dismissive attitude was now becoming a symbol of compassion and understanding. At his company, Daniel implemented a new approach to leadership. He held open forums where employees could voice their concerns and ideas, fostering an atmosphere of trust and collaboration. He also started mentorship programs, encouraging senior employees to guide and uplift their junior counterparts. The results were immediate, morale soared, and the company flourished like never before. Outside of work, Daniel's commitment to giving back deepened. He partnered with local community organizations to fund workshops for underserved neighborhoods, focusing on vocational training and skill development. One such project was a collaboration with Hector's Mechanic Shop, where young people were taught valuable technical skills for free. Daniel saw firsthand how access to opportunities could transform lives. Even in his personal life, Daniel's relationships grew stronger. Friends who had distanced themselves from his arrogance began reconnecting, drawn by the sincerity of his change. His family, too, noticed a warmth in him that had been absent for years. It was as though the walls he had built around himself were finally coming down. What Daniel hadn't anticipated was the way his story inspired others to reflect on their own actions. Employees, friends, and even strangers who heard of his transformation began embracing small acts of kindness in their daily lives. From volunteering at shelters to simply treating others with more respect, the ripple effect of Daniel's humility and empathy spread far and wide. For Daniel, the greatest reward was knowing that his efforts were creating a legacy of compassion. The man who once measured success by wealth and status now found fulfillment in uplifting others, proving that even the smallest changes could lead to profound impact. With his newfound purpose, Daniel began focusing on long-term ways to create meaningful change. He realized that true transformation wasn't about grand gestures but about sustained effort. Determined to give back, he began channeling his resources into projects that could benefit others for years to come. One of his first initiatives was funding a community training center, where people from underprivileged backgrounds could learn technical skills such as mechanics, carpentry, and electrical work. He collaborated closely with Hector, whose expertise became the cornerstone of the program. Hector's workshop turned into a hub of activity, buzzing with students eager to learn. Daniel also started a scholarship fund for young people in the area, covering tuition for those who wanted to pursue higher education or specialized training. His focus wasn't just on financial support but on mentorship, ensuring each recipient had the guidance they needed to succeed. The program became a lifeline for many, sparking hope in communities that had long felt overlooked. At his company, Daniel implemented corporate social responsibility initiatives, dedicating a portion of profits to local charities and programs. He encouraged employees to volunteer, organizing team-building activities that involved serving meals at shelters or refurbishing schools. For Daniel, this was more than a business strategy, it was a way to instill values of empathy and service in his workforce. Hector, initially reluctant to step into a leadership role, found himself at the heart of these projects. With Daniel's encouragement, he became a mentor to many young people, his humility and wisdom inspiring those who crossed his path. The once simple mechanic now stood as a respected figure in the community, his contributions shaping countless lives. For Daniel, investing in the future wasn't just about the money, it was about creating a ripple effect of kindness and opportunity. Each life he touched, directly or indirectly, became a testament to the power of humility and the importance of giving back. His journey was far from over, but the seeds he planted promised a legacy of hope and transformation. Daniel sat quietly in the corner of Hector's bustling workshop, watching as the students he had helped sponsor worked diligently under Hector's guidance. The hum of tools and the occasional laughter filled the air, a far cry from the sterile, high-stakes meetings he used to measure his life by. In this moment, Daniel felt a peace he had never known before. He reflected on how much his perspective had changed. Once, he believed that value lay in appearances, in status and wealth. Now, he understood that true worth came from the impact one had on others. Hector's life, humble and unassuming, was a living testament to that truth. Through Hector's acts of kindness and service, Daniel had seen what it meant to live with purpose. One afternoon, Hector approached Daniel, wiping grease off his hands. "You seem deep in thought," he remarked, sitting down beside him. Daniel nodded. "I've been thinking about how wrong I was," he admitted. "Not just about you, but about so many things. I spent years chasing success, but I never realized how empty it was." Hector smiled knowingly. "It's never too late to change," he said. "The important thing is that you're here now, doing something that matters." His words, simple yet profound, echoed in Daniel's heart. He realized that life wasn't about perfection but about growth, about learning from one's mistakes and striving to do better. As he left the workshop that day, Daniel felt a profound sense of gratitude, for Hector, for the second chance he had been given, and for the lessons he had learned. He knew his journey of transformation was ongoing, but he also knew he was on the right path. The man who once judged others by their appearances had learned that true greatness lay in humility, empathy, and the courage to change. As Daniel looked back on his journey, he marveled at how much had changed. The man who once prided himself on arrogance and appearances was now driven by humility and compassion. His life's purpose had shifted, from chasing personal success to creating opportunities for others. For Daniel, this transformation wasn't just a change, it was a rebirth. Hector's influence had been the turning point. His quiet humility and unwavering kindness had revealed a world Daniel had never considered, a world where success wasn't measured by wealth or status but by the lives one touched. Daniel carried this lesson with him, weaving it into every decision he made moving forward. Years later, Daniel's community efforts had grown beyond what he could have imagined. The training center expanded, offering more programs and serving as a beacon of hope for hundreds. His company thrived, not just financially but as a model of corporate responsibility. The ripple effect of his transformation inspired countless others to follow his example. But perhaps the most profound change was in Daniel's heart. He no longer saw people through the narrow lens of status or appearance. Each person, he realized, carried a unique story and potential. By choosing empathy over judgment, Daniel had found peace and purpose. As Daniel stood at the entrance of the training center one evening, watching a group of students excitedly discuss their future plans, he whispered a quiet prayer of gratitude. He thanked God for the second chance, for Hector's guidance, and for the strength to change. In that moment, Daniel felt hope, not just for himself, but for the world he was helping to build. If this story moved you, take a moment to reflect on the power of kindness and transformation. Remember, it's never too late to change. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring stories like this one. Together, let's spread hope and positivity.